Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of blood vessels. So if you've noticed, really, I only lectured on the first third or quarter of the notes in this section. So I'm not really going to go over every single one of these figures and just read off the names of the blood vessels for you. That would be kind of boring. So I want you guys to engage with this material kind of on your own. I'll be posting some videos that go over some models so you can see where these structures are. But a lot of the stuff you guys are going to need to try and kind of figure out and learn all their locations and the names. There are a couple areas that are a little bit tricky, a little bit confusing, so I'm going to take the opportunity now to go over those few sections. So if this is the first time that you've really started studying blood vessels, you really want to start big picture first, just like learn the major bones of the skeleton. Well, here we're going to learn the major structures in our vascular system. So this image right here is a great place to start. So we can see the system of arteries, and in the next one we see the system of veins, and at first pass they look pretty similar, but there are definitely some differences. Generally speaking, we're going to have more veins than arteries. Some other differences I'd like to point out. Let's start out here at the heart. So here we have a blow-up of the heart. We have the ascending aorta to the aortic arch to the descending aorta to the abdominal aorta once it passes through the diaphragm. Now, if you remember from our lecture on the heart, there were 3 branches off the aortic arch. The first one is the Brachiocephalic Trunk. Don't call it brachiocephalic because that has some ambiguity. If you were to answer brachiocephalic on a test, whatever it is, it's going to be wrong because there's a brachiocephalic trunk, there's a right brachiocephalic vein, and there's a left brachiocephalic vein. So if you just say brachiocephalic, I don't know which of these 3 structures you're talking about. So in this case, this little guy right here is the brachiocephalic trunk, and it is the first branch. It is the first branch off the aortic arch. Now the second branch off the aortic arch is the left common carotid, and the third branch would be the left subclavian. So you might be asking, okay, well, what about the right side? Well, if you notice over here, if you look at the brachiocephalic trunk, it splits into the right subclavian and the right common carotid. So what you get is on the right side of the body, the first vessel off the aortic arch is the brachiocephalic trunk, trunk meaning artery. So it will then split into the right subclavian underneath the clavicle. Where is it going? To your arm, to your brachium, right? And the common carotid, where's the common carotid going? It's going to go to the right side of your head. Now, one little thing I want to mention here, when you see common in the name, that means that vessel is going to split, or it's going to join up depending on if you're talking arteries and veins. So the common carotid is going to split into internal and external carotid arteries. So I'm just giving you a little bit of terminology to help you realize if you see common, that means the next step, it's probably going to split. And we'll see that in iliac arteries as well. But getting back to the differences between arteries and veins, here at the heart, we have 3 branches coming off of the aortic arch. Brachiocephalic trunk, which then splits into the right subclavian, right common carotid. And the next 2 branches off the aortic arch are separately the left common carotid and the left subclavian. Notice there is no left brachiocephalic trunk, right? So we don't call the brachiocephalic trunk the right brachiocephalic trunk because there's only one of them, so it doesn't get right or left. Do you need to keep track of right or left in this class? Absolutely. So when I ask for a name of a vessel, I'm going to want right or left, the name of the vessel, and if it's an artery or vein. So you always want to give me that information. So 3 branches off the aortic arch, 1 brachiocephalic trunk, which splits into the right common carotid, right subclavian, then left common carotid, then left subclavian. Now look over here in the vein, in our venic system, the superior vena cava is formed by the joining, because remember how we name these things, veins travel towards the heart. the superior vena cava is formed by the anastomosis, there's that fancy word again, the joining of the right and left brachiocephalic vein. So here we do have two brachiocephalic veins, and those two veins are each formed. The right brachiocephalic vein is going to be formed by, let me get to the image here, the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein. So on the left side is going to be the right internal jugular and the right, the right subclavian vein. So there we do have two brachiocephalics. We do have two brachiocephalic veins. So they're right and they're left. Each one of those is formed by the anastomosis of the internal jugular and the subclavian veins. All right, so that's one difference. Two branching into four. Here we just have three vessels coming off the aortic arch. Okay, this is a very useful image because it's showing you both the systemic and pulmonary circuits in a very generalized way. So this is particularly good at telling you which major organs are going to be serviced by which major arteries and veins, right? And it ties in the heart. So this is a good big picture image to start with. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is you can see here we have the left ventricle, left ventricular systole that forces blood at the aortic semilunar valve, goes to the ascending aorta, the aortic arch to the descending aorta. Now, if we follow this down, we can see that the artery is going to go to a capillary bed. This capillary bed is then drained by a vein, and the vein will eventually flow into the inferior vena cava, and from the inferior vena cava into the right atrium. So the same old thing that we've been talking about. But here, there's a different pathway I want to point out to you. Let's start again, leaving the left ventricle. We go to the aorta, we come down, and let's say we take a trip to the stomach. So in the stomach, we're going to take a vessel. Okay, we have another capillary bed shown here where we have our red blood turning into blue blood. Now what we have here is a capillary bed draining into a vein, which then drains not to the heart, but drains into a different organ. And then it drains into a vein, it drains to the heart. So we have an extra set of veins. So artery to capillary blood, I should say artery to capillary bed to vein to another capillary bed back to veins. So we have an extra capillary bed. We have an extra set of veins. Whenever you see this, this is called a portal system. An extra set of veins, extra set of capillaries. And whenever you have portal systems, important things will happen. This particular one is called the hepatic portal system because certain parts of our digestive system do not drain directly into the inferior vena cava and then go to the heart. They first are sent to the liver where they will be detoxified. So that is the main function of the hepatic portal system, is to take blood that's being drained out of things like the stomach, out of the intestines. And the first place that blood goes is not into your regular blood supply, but it goes to your liver, because if you ingest any toxins, that material will be absorbed into your blood, and then the liver can detoxify it before it gets to your circulatory system. Because if your veins that drained your intestines just went right into the inferior vena cava, that would go right to the heart, to the lungs, and then to places like your brain where it could do a tremendous amount of damage. So the hepatic portal system is an extra set of veins that allows for the selective cleaning and processing of blood that's leaving your digestive system. We'll take a closer look at this later, but here is a really nice image where you can see artery to capillary bed to extra vein to extra capillaries in the liver, back to veins, and then back to the heart. So that would be an example of a portal system. Everywhere else in the body, or non-portal systems, you're going to go from an artery to a capillary bed to a vein back to the heart. Okay, let's move on. So we can't forget that the heart has its own internal circulatory system. So we still need to be responsible for the coronary arteries, coronary veins, know how all those work together. This is something I think I pointed out in the system on our heart or in our heart chapter, right? This was a mistake, let's call it, at the Body Worlds exhibit, where this was labeled as a human heart, but in fact it is not. It's probably a pig heart, because you can see, right, that is the brachiocephalic trunk, and in pigs and most mammals, this guy here, the left common carotid branches off the brachiocephalic and not the aortic arch, right? So that's one of the ways we can tell the difference between human and non-human. Most other mammals, left common carotid is branching off the aorta. Here it's branching off the brachiocephalic trunk, so we know it's not human. Okay, so remember I mentioned that term common? This is a slightly different view. So this is brachiocephalic trunk, brachiocephalic artery, and then we're going to branch into the right common carotid, right? Because this is the view from the right side. This is the right common carotid. The common carotid splits, this case, into an internal and external carotid artery. The external carotid artery goes along the outside of the face and feeds the outside of the skull, whereas the internal carotid artery is going to split off and then enter the skull through the carotid canal. So that's that structure that we learned when dealing with the skull. So that's just an example of a common vessel splitting into something like internal or external. So brachiocephalic trunk going to the right common carotid artery, splitting into the right external carotid artery and the right internal carotid artery. So an excellent way to study this material, especially now we don't have access to models, is to actually memorize the pathway from the heart. So do you remember that circular pathway that took you through the various structures of the heart, where instead of just saying systemic arteries and systemic veins, now you can fill in those blank boxes and say, oh, I want to go to my right cheek. Trace the flow of blood using major vessels to your right cheek. So it would go something like this. You exit the left ventricle through the aortic semilunar valve, enter the ascending aorta, from the ascending aorta to the aortic arch, to the brachiocephalic trunk, to the right common carotid. From the right common carotid, you take the external carotid artery. And then the little branch off the external carotid artery that actually leads to, say, you know, the right temporal artery, probably wouldn't necessarily make you memorize that one, but here you go. Excellent way to study this material. And then what you would do is you would just go to a capillary bed and then trace your way back through the vein. So it's an excellent way to try and study this material. Now, if we continue looking, we can see this is the brachiocephalic trunk, right? Once it passes the common carotid, the vessel is now called the subclavian artery because it is now underneath your clavicle, right? Once it passes the clavicle and enters a new region, when it's in the area of your armpit, it becomes the axillary artery, right axillary artery. When it passes out of the armpit region and enters your arm, it's now called the right brachial artery. So if you guys remember your body regions from day one, right, a lot of this material you actually already know. You just need to be able to tell your right from your left, and is it blue or red? Okay. Another important difference. So I just got done telling you that the common carotid splits into an external and internal carotid arteries. Here in the veins of the neck, we have the major vein that's draining the neck is going to be the jugular vein. There is no common jugular vein. Common jugular vein does not exist. We just have an internal jugular vein and an external jugular vein. Both of these are going to join in the area of the subclavian vein. So no common jugular vein. We do have a common carotid. We do not have a common jugular. So remember that jugular foramen where the various sinuses are going to drain into, right? The dural venous sinus is the drain blood out of the brain. Eventually they join to form the sigmoidal sinus, which drains into the internal jugular vein. Well, here it is. And here's where it joins the subclavian vein, where these two fuse. Right down there is your brachiocephalic vein on the way to the heart. So the brachiocephalic vein is formed by the anastomosis of the internal jugular vein and the right subclavian vein. Notice over here that the external jugular comes down and joins the subclavian vein. So no, they do not join. The two jugulars are completely separate the entire time, internal and external. Okay, this is another important structure. This is called the circle of Willis. That's the old name. The newer name is just cerebral arterial circle. This is weird because we have a bunch of arteries joining together. Remember, arteries aren't supposed to do that. Arteries are supposed to branch and branch and branch. Here, arteries are joining together. Arteries are anastomosing, and that's kind of strange. So the circle of Willis is this structure here, right, and also connected to these vessels down here. So you notice there are many ways to get blood inside the brain. There are many pathways to take. And if you think about it for a second, this makes sense, right? The brain is a very high value organ, and it needs a constant supply of blood. It needs an uninterrupted supply of oxygen, uninterrupted supply of glucose. So, and it can't tolerate even a lack of a little bit of these things without some serious damage. So one of the reasons that we have this structure is because it provides a little bit of redundancy, a little bit of a backup. If one of these little tubes gets clogged, there may be a way to route blood around the clog. So it provides a little bit of backup in case of trouble. Also, it is believed that having multiple inputs to the brain helps ensure that there is perfectly even distribution of blood pressure throughout the brain. That's probably those two main reasons. Redundancy and a nice even pressure inside the brain are probably why we have these structures. But let's break this down. So if you look in the previous slides, you can see those transverse foramina in the cervical vertebra. Well, there's an artery and a vein passing through them, right? And those are called vertebral artery, vertebral vein. So we have a branch off the subclavian artery, passes through this transverse foramina of our cervical vertebra, the vertebral artery. So getting back to our previous image, the vertebral arteries will travel through those foramina, and they're gonna come together and enter the cranial cavity through the foramen magnum. Notice the foramen magnum will be right here, right? This is the spinal cord, this is the medulla oblongata. So the vertebral arteries enter through the foramen magnum, and they will anastomose, they will join together to form the basilar, sometimes called the basilar artery. So that's going to be the tail end of our circle of Willis. Two vertebral arteries branching off the subclavian artery join to form the basilar artery. The other main pathway into the brain are going to be those internal carotid arteries. The internal carotid arteries are going to come up from the common carotid, split. The internal carotids go through the carotid canals and then enter the brain here, right? So you can see internal carotid, internal carotid. Now what happens, it's going to enter the cranium, and they're going to turn it to the side, and they're going to start branching. So here, this is the internal carotid. Once it starts branching, you're going to have a branch here. Right, that guy is called the posterior communicating artery. Communicating means an artery that joins other arteries. So I'll get into that in a second. This is the posterior communicating artery. Here is the anterior communicating artery. Anterior communicating artery. And the continuation of the tube that was internal carotid, once you pass this point, that becomes the middle cerebral artery. So the internal carotids are going to branch into anterior communicating, posterior communicating, and middle cerebral arteries. And that's going to happen on both sides. So let me back up and tie these two structures together. The two vertebral arteries are going to anastomose to form the basilar artery. The basilar artery then splits to form two posterior cerebral arteries. So here's our posterior cerebral artery, here's our middle cerebral artery, and here's our anterior cerebral artery. So we have two vertebrals joined to form the basilar. The basilar splits to form the two posterior cerebral arteries. We have the posterior communicating artery is going to connect the posterior artery to the middle cerebral artery. And you notice here the anterior cerebral artery, it has another communicating artery that joins the two anterior cerebral arteries. This little tiny section here, this is the anterior communicating artery. There's only one. There are two posterior communicating arteries, one here, another one here, but only one anterior communicating artery shown here. A little bit confused? Come over to this color-coded image. This should make things much clearer. That right there, basilar artery. These two guys right here, posterior cerebral arteries. These are the posterior communicating arteries. These two here are the internal carotid arteries, middle cerebral, anterior cerebral artery, anterior cerebral artery, anterior communicating artery. So we got a lot of structures here, a lot of names. You definitely want to have this one clear in your head. So things to remember. Probably the easiest way to approach that. Posterior cerebral, middle cerebral, anterior cerebral. The arteries that connect to other arteries, those are communicating, and you have 1, 2, 3. Two posterior communicating, one anterior communicating. Other thing you need to add to that would be the two internal carotids, the basilar, and walking backwards from the basilar to vertebral. So hopefully this makes some amount of sense. Might I ask you, what is the name of that vessel versus the name of this vessel versus the name of that vessel versus the name of that vessel? Sure, that's definitely something that will end up on exams. Okay. Dural venal sinuses, right? These were some of the structures that help drain blood out of the brain. And once again, this is pertinent to this chapter. So even though we finished our section on brain, I might still test you here because this is a structure that drains blood out of the brain. Thus, it is fair game for this session or this chapter. Okay, some few things to point out in this sort of thoracic abdominal view of our arterial system. Right here, coming off of our subclavian, we have the internal thoracic. It's a little hard to tell. This artery is on the anterior wall, the inside anterior wall of the chest cavity. Another term for this that's frequently used is called the mammillary artery because it's going to feed mammary glands. So there is the internal thoracic artery. It is on the inside front chest wall. Let's see here, we're going to have the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, to the descending thoracic to the abdominal. Notice that there is a hole in the diaphragm through which the aorta passes. The first branch, the first major branch off the abdominal aorta is something called the celiac trunk. Now, any of you who are familiar with Greek mythology, the Scylla was a multi-headed sea monster. The reason it has this name is because the celiac trunk immediately branches into 3 vessels, which we will take a look at in a second. So we're going to have the first major branch is the celiac trunk, followed by the superior mesenteric artery. So your mesenteries refer to intestines, basically. We're also going to have 2 renal arteries, left and right renal artery. These are the arteries that are going to service the kidney. Now, your adrenal glands, where you get your adrenaline from, they have their own arteries. Those are going to be the suprarenal artery. It makes sense because it's the adrenal gland, this little blob of fat-looking thing sitting on top of your kidney. Well, the artery that goes to the kidney is the renal artery. The adrenal gland sits on top of it, so it's the suprarenal artery. Okay. Now, celiac trunk, superior mesenteric, 2 renal arteries. because we had a superior mesenteric, that implies that we're going to have another version, and that is that one down there, the inferior mesenteric artery. Now here on either side, in between the two mesenteric arteries, we have gonadal arteries. So what gonad refers to are going to be the organs that produce gametes. So what am I talking? I'm talking eggs and sperm. So technically people don't have gonads. They usually will have ovaries if they have eggs, or they have testes if they make sperm. Now, if you think about this for a second, this totally makes sense for ovaries, because where are your ovaries? Your ovaries are inside your abdomen. What about testes? Testes are not inside the abdomen. Do ovarian arteries branch here? Yes, they do. Do testicular arteries branch here? Absolutely, yes, they do. Because during fetal development, testes are created, they develop inside the abdominal cavity, and before birth, in humans at any rate, they migrate down and they pass through the abdominal wall, and then they enter the scrotum. So because they originate in the same place, they have their roots in the same structure. So just something to be aware of. Testicular arteries and ovarian arteries are still going to branch from the same region of the abdominal aorta. Okay, let's continue down our path of the aorta. Aortic arch, ascending aorta to the aortic arch, to the thoracic or descending thoracic aorta, to the abdominal aorta. First branch off the abdominal aorta is the celiac trunk, followed by the superior mesenteric artery, followed by the two renal arteries. Then we're going to have the two gonadal, which will either be testicular arteries or ovarian arteries, followed by the inferior mesenteric artery. Now the aorta comes to an end. So the aorta is going to split, and the aorta will split into the right and left common iliac arteries. Common, so that tells you it's going to split into some other name that includes iliac. Why is it called iliac? Because this is your ilium, right? Your bones of the os coxae. So if we notice that in this case, the left common iliac artery will then split into the left external iliac artery and the left internal iliac artery, as we might suppose. When that left external iliac artery passes this structure here called the inguinal ligament, remember inguinal means groin. Once it passes that landmark, it becomes left femoral artery. Remember, femoral refers to your thigh region. Okay, so those are sort of the major divisions. Oh, one thing I should point out, getting back to my original here, are internal thoracic. Internal thoracic comes down, and once it sort of exits the area of the rib cage, it's going to become the epigastric arteries and superior epigastric arteries. And here we have something weird. The superior epigastric arteries are going to join, they're going to anastomose with these inferior epigastric arteries, which themselves branch off the external iliac artery. So here's another unusual example where we have an anastomosis. One originates up here off the subclavian artery. The other epigastric artery is going to originate down here off the external iliac artery. And they're going to come together and meet in the abdomen. So just another thing to be aware of, an unusual situation where two arteries are joining. Okay, in the veins, some more differences. Remember, we're going to have two vessels fusing to form the superior vena cava. So we're going to have two brachiocephalic veins. We're going to have right and left. We're still going to have our internal thoracic vein, so that's similar to what we saw in the arteries. Now back here in the posterior, we have a different situation. This guy right here is called the azygous vein. This is the azygous vein, and notice it makes a little J shape. So this here is the azygous vein. When it makes this J shape, that becomes the accessory hemiazygous. So azygous takes this little dog leg to the accessory hemiazygous. Notice that there's a little break here. So coming down here, this is the hemiazygous. This is a weird situation. So azygous to the hemiazygous. azygous to the accessory hemiazygous. And those will branch into the intercostal veins. Right posterior intercostal veins. Just kind of be aware of that. Let's see, over here, we're not going to have a celiac trunk, but we're going to have the hepatic veins. These are just going to be veins that will drain the liver. We will still have some renal veins. We're going to have gonadal veins. We're going to have left and right common iliac veins. Left and right common iliac veins are going to be formed by the anastomosis of external and internal iliac veins. So at least that part is similar. We will have right and left inferior epigastric veins. So that will be some similarities between the two. Let's see. All right. Celiac trunk. So I remember I mentioned the celiac trunk was the first major branch of the abdominal aorta, right? Once the aorta passes through the diaphragm. You need to memorize the 3 branches of the celiac trunk. The first is called the left gastric artery because it's going to feed the left portion of the stomach. So left gastric artery, followed by the splenic artery, because the splenic artery is going to go to the spleen and feed the spleen. And the last one is called the common hepatic artery. So you see that term common, that means it's going to split later on. So the 3 branches of the celiac trunk: left gastric, splenic, and common hepatic. This is an image showing blood flow to the large intestine. We have our superior up here and inferior mesenteric arteries. And notice this also has a great amount of anastomosis. Intestines are really big. They need a lot of blood supply. So we're having a lot of interconnected vessels. Do you need to memorize all these tiny little branches? Right colic, middle colic, ileocecal artery? No, it's kind of beyond the expectations of this class. Just realize that all these are going to loop together and service the intestines. That's really the main takeaway from this slide here. Okay, now we come to the hepatic portal system, something that I mentioned way back in this slide here, where I mentioned that we're going to have an artery to a capillary bed, to veins, to another capillary bed, back to veins. We have an extra set here. This has something to do with purifying blood once we have digested our food. So the hepatic portal system is this extra set of veins that all drain into the liver. The function of the liver, one of the functions of the liver, is to detoxify blood. So you eat a meal, that food goes through your GI system. These organs are going to be supplied by arterial blood because they need to get oxygen-rich blood to keep your organs of your digestive system alive. Now, once they've taken out that oxygen, just like any other capillary bed in the systemic part of the circulatory system, you're going to have oxygen-rich blood coming in and oxygen-poor blood coming out. So into your stomach, into your intestines, red in, blue out. But here in the intestines, when you've digested your food, this needs to be absorbed into your circulatory system because that's how the rest of your cells of your body are going to be fed. So draining the stomach, draining the small intestines, draining part of the large intestine, you're going to have oxygen poor but nutrient rich blood. Now those nutrient rich blood may carry toxins, so all that stuff needs to be sent to the liver so it can be completely detoxified before being returned to your circulatory system. So this system of veins that drains the organs of the digestive system to the liver is called the hepatic portal system. So people tend to get a little bit confused by this because the hepatic portal vein is a vein that goes into an organ. That's weird. Everything else we've talked about, arteries go from the heart to an organ, and veins go out the organ back to the heart. Here we have something different. The hepatic portal vein goes into the liver. What drains the liver? The hepatic veins drain the liver. So here we have a situation where we have 2 ends in the liver. common hepatic artery takes oxygen-rich but nutrient-poor blood to the liver. The hepatic portal vein carries oxygen-poor but nutrient-rich blood to the liver to be detoxified. And then the hepatic veins drain oxygen-poor, pure, nutrient-rich blood back to our circulatory system. So don't confuse hepatic veins out with hepatic portal vein, which is in. So hopefully this should be fairly clear. The arm, easy peasy. If you remember your body regions, you got this. So you have, since this is the right arm, just walk through starting from left ventricle. Left ventricle after the aortic stemming lunar valve to the ascending aorta to the aortic arch to the brachiocephalic trunk, from the brachiocephalic trunk to the subclavian artery, from the subclavian artery to the axillary artery, from the axillary artery into, the brachial artery. From the brachial artery, now we have a branch, just like we had radial and ulnar sides of the arm. Well, we have a radial and ulnar artery, right? But this branching can't go on forever. So what you're going to get are two arches where these two blood vessels, the radial and ulnar arteries, are going to rejoin. So we have a deep and superficial palmar arch artery where the radial and ulnar arteries are going to join together. And coming off this arch, you're going to have the digital arteries. And the digital arteries are named after the digits. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can just follow the regions through the arm, right? And then the radial and ulnar are going to join to form this arch. And then you're going to get finger arteries or digit arteries that are branching off this arch. Now, in the system of veins in the arm, there's some differences because I told you that we have more veins than we have arteries. So what this image shows is we're still going to have our subclavian vein, our axillary vein, our brachial vein, two brachial veins. We're going to have radial and ulnar veins, but now we're going to have some additional vessels. These guys in light purple, these are two superficial veins. You look down here, the dark purple ones are deep veins. So these are deep inside our limb. These purple ones are superficial veins. They're much closer to the surface. So this more superior one is called the cephalic vein. Why you find the cephalic vein in the arm, I don't know. It beats me. You would expect to find this thing in the head, but you don't. It's in the arm. If it helps you remember that the cephalic vein is closer to your head, great. Maybe that'll help you remember it. Another important vein is this one here called the Basilic Vein. It's a little more inferior, a little bit more closer to your feet, Basilic Vein. Now, we're going to get a bit of a complicated mess here, but we're going to have this crossover point here, this median cubital vein. Remember, this is your cubital region, it's your antecubital region. This is cubital, antecubital, right? Middle cubital vein. This is often one of the ones that people are going to go for. And notice, it is going right across this thin part of your arm. It's a superficial vein, and that's one of the reasons why people tend to go for this one. Or phlebotomists tend to go for that one. But again, radial, ulnar veins are going to join to form, in this case, a superficial or deep palmar venous arch. And joining up with those are going to be the various digital veins. So that's very similar to what we saw in the arterial system. Okay, in the leg. So the leg is a similar story to the arm. So following the abdominal aorta, the abdominal aorta is going to split into the common iliac artery. The common iliac artery, that tells you you're going to have a split between the internal and external iliac artery. Once you pass the inguinal ligament, you become femoral artery. Now we're going to have a branch, right? This big branch, the first branch off femoral artery is called the deep femoral because it runs deep inside the leg. The femoral artery exits more on the anterior side. It exits your abdominal cavity and enters your femoral region on the anterior side. As it passes through your leg, it starts to move more posterior. So it's here in front of, anterior to your pelvis, and then it's going to go behind the kneecap. So it's going to start running posterior. Once the femoral artery goes behind your knee, it becomes the popliteal artery because this is your popliteal region. So the popliteal artery is going to go behind the knee and it's going to split. It's going to split. Half of it is going to go anterior, and that's going to become your anterior tibial artery. And part of it is going to go posterior, and that becomes the posterior tibial artery. Right? The anterior and posterior tibial arteries are going to come together to form the medial plantar artery. So it's a similar sort of story that we saw with the palmar arch. Now we have medial plantar artery and making this plantar arch, giving us again digital arteries. So here we just have the addition of a deep femoral. Once the femoral artery goes behind the knee, it becomes the popliteal. Popliteal then splits anterior and posterior, because in the arms it went radial ulnar. Now it's going posterior and anterior, posterior, and we end in an arch and end in digital arteries. Okay, in the leg, like in the arm, we have some extra vessels. So running alongside the deep femoral artery, we're going to have a deep femoral vein shown right there. The femoral vein plays the same game that the femoral artery did. Femoral to popliteal vein to anterior and posterior tibial veins into plantar arches leading to digital veins. So that's all similar. You learn the one, you get the vein for free. We do have an extra superficial vessel here. So this guy that's more medial, we're going to get the great saphenous vein. So the great saphenous vein is an extra superficial vein that's going to be draining the leg, and it's going to anastomose or join the femoral vein at the same level that the deep femoral vein does. So that's just the one extra addition here. Remember, you can't forget about a pulmonary circuit. It's real short, but just remember, colors are going to change. Pulmonary circuit arteries are blue, right side of the heart to the lungs. Veins are going to be red. Arteries always squirt because they have the energy from the right side of the heart going to the lungs. They're going to lose the energy going through pulmonary capillaries. So pulmonary capillaries are not going to be feeding tissue so much. They're going to be more surrounding little bags of air called alveoli, where the blood can then release carbon dioxide, pick up oxygen, go from blue to red, and then you get red ooze going through the pulmonary veins to return to the left atrium. So you definitely want to be able to like plot all these kinds of things out. Right, so that should look familiar. We've seen this before. Now, I'm not going to walk through these last set of slides, but I have updated your lecture notes to include this. If you check this out, you will see these pathways. Some people really like these because you can follow schematically the path of the vessels and not actually have to follow all the crazy little branching things. So this can be very, very useful, right? There is your aortic arch. You can see the 3 branches off the aorta and work your way from one place to another. So some people find this very, very, very useful to study. If it's useful for you, great. If not, then don't worry about it. I also have ones for the vein. So here we have draining blood out of the brain. You can see we have the dural venous sinuses. We can have what would appear to be drainage of the upper limbs. Right, and you can just go through all these structures on your own. So with that, we have come to the conclusion of our lecture, and really this is the lab material as well for the vessels. We have several days set aside for learning our blood vessels, but I've pretty much all delivered it in one package for you guys. So I will be posting some other videos that go over the various structures from the models. I was not able to record that material before we were forced into distance learning. Thankfully, I had a colleague of mine at another institution record them for me. She was kind enough to share those videos. So we will be using those videos that she produced. She's the head of anatomy over at Golden West College. So thank you, Anna Maria, for making those available for students who didn't necessarily get a chance to look at those models. So thanks to her, and thanks for you guys. Hope you're doing well. We will see you next time. Take care.